Introduction to the PT6 engine that's located in the Piper Meridian. We want to start with an exterior view of the PT6A-42A engine. And we'll start with the inlet. As you notice, the inlet is located just below the exhaust stacks. The inlet actually goes all the way to near the very aft of the engine, and that's where the air enters the engine. We'll see that here in a couple of seconds. Looking at the engine from on top, looking down on the engine, we don't see the accessory gearbox, which is located to the right of the intake, but we see the intake with a 1/4 inch mesh screen, 1/4 inch, so that no parts should ever get sucked into the engine. And of course there's a box built around it where the cowling sits on top of it, again, so no parts, no objects, no foreign object damage should be able to happen to the engine. And as we move forward, we go to the compressor section, located here. We go into the combustion section, located in this area, where we have fuel introduced to the engine, we have ignition introduced, and then that's what creates the power. The hot exhaust now goes past the compressor turbine wheel, they call it the CT wheel, and then past the power turbine wheels, out the exhaust. The power turbine wheels are connected through the reduction gearbox to the propeller. Again, we're looking at it from the left, and back in this area would be the accessory gearbox, intake, compression, combustion or power, exhaust, reduction gearbox, and then I've cut off the propeller so we don't see that on this picture. Also, a couple other things we want to introduce here besides the accessory gearbox, which contains the oil tank. As we move forward, we see the intake, and we see one of the bleed-off valves. There's two bleed-off valves. Since this is just an introduction to the engine, we won't go into detail on those at all. Also, the compression section, at the outlet of the compressor is the diffuser vanes, and that's where we tap off for a number of things, for pressurization, for heating, for the fuel control unit, and so on. And I guess I mentioned before, the igniters and the fuel is introduced in this section, and the power turbine wheels, and then the exhaust. And then we go forward to the reduction gearbox and the propeller. The accessory gearbox contains a number of sections which are really important. One, of course, the oil tank, which has oil pressure and oil return pumps, the oil level dipstick. We have an oil level sight gauge. The fuel control unit is mounted on a high pressure fuel pump, which is mounted on the accessory gearbox. The starter, combination generator, fuel oil heater, the low pressure fuel pump, so they both are engine driven, belt driven alternator, and belt driven air conditioning compressor. Looking at the accessory gearbox from on top, and we can see the fuel control unit, we can see the low pressure fuel pump, we see the pulleys for both the alternator and the air conditioning compressor. We have the oil level dipstick, and fortunately for us, Piper had Pratt & Whitney design the case so that we can check the oil level right here. As long as it's in the green, we're in good shape. We normally want to keep it about midway point to about an inch above the red line, so we don't have to pull the dipstick unless we want to add oil. oil sight gauge, different type of oil going to turbine engines. Typically what we use is BP, the 2380 oil. We don't want to mix oil types, and we certainly don't want to put in oil that belongs in a piston engine. Oil cooler. And then we'll go into the interior of the PT6 engine. Just like a piston engine, we need intake, compression, power, and exhaust. Here we have a cutaway of a PT6 engine. This would be again the intake. We've removed the screen. We have three what they call axial flow compressors. 1, 2, 3. Then we have a centrifugal compressor. And at the outlet of the centrifugal flow compressor, then we have the diffuser vanes. Air comes in here, and again that's where we tap off for pressurization for the aircraft and numerous other things. We call that the P3 section, so you'll hear the term in classroom a lot, the P3 air. In compressor section, axial flow, we don't see the centrifugal very well. Diffuser vanes goes into the combustion section. You can see where fuel is introduced here. Igniters, 2 igniters. And now the air actually comes in here and actually reverses flow, and then turns around, reverses again, goes through the compressor turbine wheel. The compressor turbine wheel is to run the compressor section, the axial flow compressor. Typical turbine wheel, compressor turbine wheel, and the pipe completely separate. In fact, the back side of the engine, the key or gas generator section, turn clockwise as viewed, whereas the forward part of P3 air we see being tapped. Diffuser vanes, bleed off valve. On the bleed off valve, quick flow compressors that the centrifugal stall out, so we bleed off some of the flow so they don't get compressor stall. Exhaust and also reduction gearbox. We have the propeller governor, or some people call it the constant speed unit, and we also have a chip detector in case the reduction gearbox makes metal. Looking inside the reduction gearbox, we'll see a sun gear with what they call the planetary gears going, and we also see the gear for the overspeed governor. And we have the engine controls, power lever, power control lever. We have 3 positions of forward power, and that includes the reverse position, condition lever or fuel cutoff and feather lever. And we have a manual override lever, which we'll talk about in class. Very important, but rarely used. Engine indications, instead of manifold pressure and mixture control, we have no mixture control. Actually, we either have the condition lever forward, giving it fuel, allowing the fuel control unit to decide how much fuel is needed, or we have it aft, cutting off the fuel to the engine, which of course will shut down the engine and feather the propeller quickly. So what we have instead, we have torque, we have ITT or interstage turbine temperature, and then as I mentioned, the NG section, the aft section, what they call the gas generator section. And just looking quickly at some of the indications, the co-pilot's engine display unit can display numerous pages. We're only showing the normal page here, which is the vacuum, fuel flow, oil temperature, oil pressure, fuel quantity, outside air temperature, estimated time en route, and fuel at destination. So that's just a short introduction to the Piper Meridian engine, and we'll spend approximately 5 hours in class on the engine to really understand it completely. Although it's quite simple to operate, It is important to understand it, and there's very few things on this engine that can be damaged by our doings. Now, during the start process, we do want to make sure that the temperature never gets over 1,000 degrees, and normally it's in the 750 to 800 degrees range in the starting process, but we always want to watch that. This is an engine that's derated from about 1,000 horsepower to 500, and what that does is allow us to have 500 horsepower up to about 23 to 26,000 feet, and then we get into temperature limitations, and we may not be able to get quite 500 horsepower above those altitudes. Looking forward to finishing the training on